After my husband died, I found a note. Open our garage on June 20, 2026, not before. I waited almost a year for that day. When I finally opened the door that morning, there was a safe inside. Inside it, $6 million in cash. What I saw next changed my life forever. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. For 11 years, my life had the shape of something I never questioned. I was Sarah Reed, 41 years old, living in a quiet brick house on Maple Hollow Road outside Asheville, North Carolina, with my husband Daniel and our 15-year-old daughter Mia. Daniel ran a custom home building company with his college friend Greg Walsh, Reed and Walsh Builders. And for most of our marriage, that company had been the engine of everything good in our lives. The house, Mia's private school, the lake cabin we rented every August. Daniel was the kind of man who fixed the gutters himself and still called his mother every Sunday. He wasn't flashy. He wore the same brown jacket for 6 winters. So when I think back now to the year before he died, what strikes me isn't any single dramatic moment. It's how quietly the cracks started showing. It began in the spring of 2025. Daniel started staying later at the office, but not in the way he used to, energized by a new project. This was different. He'd come home pale, distracted, checking his phone at the dinner table in a way he never had before. Once I asked him directly what was wrong, and he gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said, "Just numbers, Sarah. Boring stuff." I let it go. We'd been married 15 years. I trusted the rhythm of him, even when the rhythm changed. Then came the locked filing cabinet in the garage. Daniel had always kept his home office open. Bills, warranties, old tax returns, nothing secret. But that spring he bought a heavy steel cabinet, the kind with a combination lock, and installed it himself in the garage, bolted to the concrete. When I asked about it, he said it was for important paperwork, in case anything happens to the house. I remember laughing and saying, "Like what, a tornado?" He didn't laugh back. There were other things, small enough that I dismissed them individually, but that, strung together now, looked like a pattern. A late-night phone call I overheard part of, Daniel's voice low and tight saying, "Greg, you can't keep doing this and expect me to look the other way." A withdrawal of $4,000 from our joint savings that he explained as covering a supplier shortfall. Money that never showed up again in any account I could find. A weekend in April when he drove 2 hours to Charlotte without telling me why, and came back looking like he'd aged 5 years. I asked him, more than once, if something was wrong at the company. He always said the same thing. "I'm handling it. I don't want you carrying this." I think now that he meant it kindly, he wanted to protect me. But at the time, it felt like a wall going up between us, brick by brick, and I didn't know how to climb it. On the morning of June 14th, 2025, Daniel collapsed at his desk at the Reed and Walsh office. The paramedics said it was a massive cardiac event, sudden, nothing anyone could have predicted or prevented. He was 45 years old. I remember standing in the hospital corridor in my gardening clothes, dirt still under my fingernails, listening to a doctor I'd never met tell me my husband was gone, and feeling like the floor of my life had simply been removed. the funeral, the casseroles, the well-meaning silences. I moved through all of it the way you move through deep water, slow and half-drowned. It was 3 days after the funeral, while I was finally going through his desk drawers at home, that I found the envelope. Plain white, my name written on the front in his handwriting, sealed. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I'm so sorry. There is one thing I need you to do, and I need you to do it exactly as I say. Do not open our garage cabinet, do not touch the safe inside it until June 20th, 2026, not 1 day before. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like I've lost my mind, but there are reasons, and they matter more than you can imagine right now. Trust me one more time. I love you. Take care of Mia. D. I read it 4 times before I understood it was real. A safe? I had never seen a safe in our garage. I went out that night with a flashlight and found it, tucked behind the steel cabinet, bolted into the floor, a heavy black combination safe I had genuinely never noticed in 15 years of parking my car 6 feet away from it. I wanted to open it immediately. Of course I did. My husband was dead. There was a hidden safe in my garage, and every instinct in me screamed to know what was inside. But something about the specificity of the date, not soon, not when you're ready, but June 20th, 2026, almost exactly a year away, stopped my hand every single time I reached for the dial. Daniel had never been a man of riddles. If he asked for exactness, there was a reason, and some part of me, some part that still trusted him completely even in death, decided to honor it. So I waited. 11 months and 6 days. And on the morning of June 20th, 2026, with Mia at school and my hands shaking so badly I had to try the combination 3 times, I opened that gray steel door and found a safe inside, just as he'd promised. I turned the dial to the numbers I'd found taped beneath his nightstand drawer. Our wedding date, and the safe clicked open. Inside, stacked in neat bricks wrapped in plastic, was more cash than I had ever seen in my life. $6 million. And beneath the money, a second envelope thicker than the first, with my name on it again. I had no idea yet that opening that safe wasn't the end of anything. It was only the beginning. I sat on the cold concrete floor of my garage for almost an hour before I could make myself move. $6 million in cash does something strange to a person's sense of reality. It doesn't feel like wealth, not at first. It feels like evidence of something you don't understand yet. Something heavy and dangerous that's been sitting 6 feet from your car for 11 months without your knowledge. I didn't touch the bricks of cash. I reached instead for the second envelope. Inside were photocopies, bank statements, a handwritten ledger in Daniel's cramped writing, and a letter, longer than the first one, dated only 10 days before he died. Sarah, if you're reading this, it means I never found the courage or the time to fix this myself. For almost 2 years, Greg has been skimming money from client escrow accounts, funds homeowners paid us for builds that never fully happened, or houses we billed twice for through shell suppliers. I found out by accident in early 2024, going through reconciliation reports he thought I'd never read closely. I confronted him privately. He begged me not to go to the state licensing board, said he'd pay it all back, said it would destroy both our families and the 40 employees who depend on us. I was weak. I let him fix it quietly instead of doing what I should have done immediately. He never fixed it. He kept going. The $6 million in this safe is what I managed to recover and set aside. Some of it traced back from accounts Greg thought were hidden, some of it our own savings that I moved here for safety, because I was afraid of what he might do if he felt cornered. I started keeping records of everything. I was building a case I intended to take to the state board and, if necessary, the FBI on the 1-year anniversary of our partnership agreement renewal, June 20th, 2026 SUS, because that's the date our operating agreement specifies that if I die and you, as my surviving spouse, haven't sold my shares back to Greg within 12 months, full ownership reverts permanently to you, with no further claim he can make. I didn't want him pressuring you into a quick, lowball sale before that date, using grief as leverage. I wanted you protected, with full legal standing, before any of this became public. I'm sorry I couldn't finish this myself. Please, go to Tom Bishop. He's the only lawyer I trust completely. He already has copies of some of this. Use the money to make this right for the families Greg hurt, and to keep yourself and Mia safe. I love you both more than anything. D. I read it sitting on the garage floor with my back against the cold steel cabinet, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Grief curdling slowly into a colder, harder feeling I didn't yet have a name for. Daniel hadn't just died. He'd been carrying this alone, terrified, for almost 2 years, trying to protect me from a danger he never fully explained because he didn't want me to live in fear. And now I understood the late nights, the locked cabinet, the drawn gray look that had settled over his face that final spring. My first instinct was panic. If this was real, and the documents looked devastatingly real, names, dates, dollar amounts that matched invoices I vaguely remembered seeing on our kitchen counter over the years, then Greg Walsh, a man who had eaten Thanksgiving dinner at my table a dozen times, who'd been a pallbearer at my husband's funeral, had been stealing from grieving families for 2 years and had let my husband carry the weight of it until it killed him with stress, if not literally. What frightened me more was the realization that Greg had been calling me every few weeks since the funeral, gently, persistently, asking when I'd be ready to talk business. Meaning, I now understood, when I'd be ready to sell Daniel's half of the company back to him. He'd brought a casserole himself twice. He'd offered to help me with the boring legal stuff. He had been so kind. The thought made my stomach turn. I sat there a long time doing the math Daniel had clearly already done. June 20th had just passed at midnight. Today's date. The deadline in the operating agreement had come and gone, and according to Daniel's letter, full ownership of his half of Reed and Walsh Builders was now legally mine, untouchable by any pressure Greg might apply. I hadn't sold anything. I hadn't signed anything. For 11 months, without understanding why, I had unknowingly protected myself simply by waiting exactly as my husband asked. That night, after Mia went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with the ledger spread out in front of me and made a decision. I wasn't going to call Greg back with some vague excuse the way I had for months. I was going to call Tom Bishop first thing in the morning. I was going to find out carefully and legally exactly what my husband had uncovered, and exactly what my rights now were. I didn't know yet how to bring down a man I'd known for 15 years, but I knew where to start, and for the first time since Daniel died, I felt something other than grief steering me forward. I locked the safe, locked the garage, and for the first time in 11 months, I slept without the strange, formless dread that had followed me since I'd found that first envelope. In its place was something sharper: purpose. Tom Bishop had been Daniel's attorney since the company's earliest days, a careful, soft-spoken man in his 60s, with an office above a bakery on Biltmore Avenue that always smelled faintly of cinnamon. I called him at 8 the next morning, and by 10 I was sitting across from his desk with Daniel's ledger and letter spread between us. He read everything twice, in total silence, and when he finally looked up, his expression had none of its usual warmth. "Daniel came to me about 8 months ago," he said quietly. "Not with everything. He was still building his case," he said, "still scared of moving too fast. But he gave me a sealed envelope and told me if anything ever happened to him, and you came to me with documents from a hidden safe, I was to open it immediately." He pulled a thick folder from his bottom drawer, a folder that had apparently been sitting there for 8 months, waiting for this exact morning. He knew Sarah. He knew something might happen to him. I don't think he knew how. I don't think this is anything sinister. The autopsy was clear. It was his heart. But he knew the stress of this was killing him slowly, and he wanted to be ready. That sentence landed harder than I expected. My husband had spent the last months of his life quietly preparing for his own death because he was afraid of what carrying this secret was doing to his body. I sat with that for a moment before I could speak again. Tom and I spent the next 2 hours going through everything: Daniel's ledger, the photocopied statements, invoices for materials that were billed to client accounts but never purchased, payments routed through a supplier company that, when Tom looked it up on his laptop right there in the office, turned out to be registered to Greg's wife, Donna Walsh. It was not a small operation. Tom estimated conservatively that Greg had diverted close to $4 million from at least 11 different client escrow accounts over 2 years. Money meant for homes that were either never finished with cheaper materials than build, or never started at all, leaving elderly retirees and young families alike out tens of thousands of dollars each. "This needs to go to the state licensing board and very likely the FBI," Tom said. "But Sarah, I need you to understand, once we file this, there's no taking it back. Greg will know within days, maybe hours. He's going to fight this with everything he has, and he is not going to fight fair." I thought about the casseroles, the phone calls, the pallbearer at my husband's funeral. "He already isn't fighting fair," I said. "He's just been doing it quietly." We filed the initial complaint with the North Carolina Licensing Board for General Contractors that same afternoon, along with a formal request that Tom, on my behalf, exercise my new ownership rights under the operating agreement to demand a full financial audit of Reed and Walsh Builders. It felt in the moment like the single bravest thing I had ever done, and also like dropping a lit match into a building I didn't yet know was full of gasoline. By Thursday, 3 days later, the shift had already started. I drove to the company office to collect some of Daniel's personal belongings, things his old assistant had boxed up for me, and the receptionist, a young woman named Priya who I'd known for years, wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "Mr. Walsh wants to know if you can call him," she said carefully. "He says it's important." I called Greg that evening, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and kept my voice as steady as I could manage. He was warm at first, almost too warm, asking how Mia was doing, how I was holding up. Then, casually, almost as an afterthought, "Hey, I heard from my lawyer that there's some paperwork moving around about an audit. I'm sure it's just routine with the ownership transfer and everything. But I wanted to make sure you weren't getting bad advice from someone trying to make a complicated situation more complicated than it needs to be." I told him, as evenly as I could, that I was simply exercising my rights as the new owner of Daniel's share, and that I trusted my attorney completely. There was a pause on the line, just slightly too long before Greg said, Of course you do. Let's talk soon, okay? I think there's a lot we should discuss, just the two of us, before things get any more complicated than they need to be." I hung up shaking, but underneath the fear was something else, a strange, grim clarity. He hadn't denied anything. He hadn't asked what audit, what paperwork, what was going on. He already knew exactly what I'd found, or at least suspected enough to be afraid of it. 2 days after that call, Tom phoned me with the first real proof. A forensic accountant Tom had brought in had cross-referenced 3 of the supplier invoices in Daniel's ledger against actual building permits filed with the city, and found that 2 of the houses billed for premium foundation work had never had that work done at all. It was no longer a grieving widow's suspicion or a dead man's paranoid letter. It was documented, verifiable fraud, with Greg Walsh's signature on the falsified paperwork. There was no going back now, even if I'd wanted to. And looking at Mia doing her homework at the kitchen table that night, oblivious to the storm gathering around us, I understood that I didn't want to. Tom moved fast once the forensic accountant's findings came back. Within a week, he had filed a formal demand for a complete independent audit of Reed and Walsh Builders' books, citing my ownership rights, and had quietly forwarded copies of the falsified permits to a contact he knew at the FBI's field office in Charlotte, who handled white-collar fraud cases involving federally insured construction loans. "This moves slowly," he warned me. "Weeks, maybe months before anything official happens. But the moment Greg's lawyer sees this audit request with permit numbers attached, he'll know exactly how much we have." He was right. 3 days later, on a Tuesday evening, I was in the kitchen helping Mia with an essay on the civil rights movement when the doorbell rang. It was Greg, alone, still in his work clothes, his usual easy smile nowhere in sight. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door mostly closed behind me, not wanting Mia to hear. "Sarah," he said, and his voice had a tightness I'd never heard from him before. "I think we need to talk, and I think we need to talk without lawyers standing between us. We've known each other 15 years. Daniel was my best friend." "Then you understand why I'm doing this," I said. His jaw worked for a moment. "You don't understand what you're doing. You're about to blow up a company with 40 employees, 40 families, because of some numbers you don't have the full context for. Daniel and I had an arrangement about how we handled cash flow shortfalls. It wasn't theft, it was business. Complicated business. If you take this to the state board, if you take this to the FBI, I lose everything, Sarah. My house, my kids' college funds, everything. And for what? Money you already have $6 million of sitting in your garage?" The fact that he knew the exact figure, the exact location, hit me like a slap. Daniel had never told him about the safe. I was certain of that. which meant Greg had either been watching us closely enough to guess, or someone had told him. I kept my face as still as I could. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. "Don't insult me." His voice dropped, harder now. "I know Daniel was building some kind of file on me before he died. I know you've got it. Here's what I need you to understand. If this goes to the board, if this goes federal, it's not going to just be my name in the paperwork. Daniel signed off on plenty of those invoices too, Sarah. He knew about the supplier arrangement from the start. Whatever he told you in some deathbed letter. You start pulling this thread. You're not just unraveling me. You're going to unravel his name too, in front of Mia, in front of this whole town. Is that really what you want for your daughter? To watch her father's name dragged through a fraud investigation?" It was. I understood even as fear closed cold fingers around my chest, a threat dressed as a warning. He was telling me, as plainly as he dared on my own front porch, that he would drag Daniel's reputation down with his own if I didn't back off. True or not, the accusation alone would be enough to do damage. "I think you should leave," I said, and was relieved to hear that my voice didn't shake. "Sarah, talk to my lawyer." I went back inside and locked the door, my hands trembling now that he couldn't see them, and stood in the front hallway listening until I heard his truck pull out of the driveway. I called Tom that night and told him everything, word for word, while it was still fresh. He was quiet for a moment. "That's not nothing, Sarah. That's an implied threat against your husband's posthumous reputation. Possibly an attempt at witness intimidation, given that you're a key party in an active fraud complaint. I'm documenting this, and I want you to consider, not now, but soon, whether you'd be comfortable with a home security camera by your front door." The suggestion frightened me more than I let on. I hung up and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, listening to the ordinary sounds of my own house, the refrigerator humming, the tick of the hallway clock, and thinking about how quickly 15 years of casseroles and birthday parties had curdled into something that felt, for the first time in my life, dangerous. I didn't sleep well that night or the next. By the end of the week, I felt frayed in a way I recognized from the worst weeks right after Daniel's funeral. That particular exhaustion that isn't really about sleep at all. So I did something I hadn't let myself do since this all began. I asked my sister Karen if Mia and I could come stay at her place upstate for a few days, away from the house, away from the phone calls, away from the driveway where Greg's truck had idled. Karen didn't ask many questions. She just said, "Come now." And I packed a bag before I could talk myself out of it. Those 4 days at Karen's farmhouse, walking her dogs along the creek with Mia, cooking dinners that had nothing to do with grief or fraud or $6 million in a garage safe, were the first quiet I'd had in almost a year. I needed them more than I'd realized. I came home on Sunday evening tired but steadier, ready for whatever came next. The call came on a Wednesday morning, 10 days after Greg's visit to my porch, while I was at the kitchen table paying bills. Not Greg this time. A man who introduced himself as Carl Higgins, attorney for Reed and Walsh Builders, his voice smooth in the particular way that made me instinctively distrust him before he'd finished his second sentence. "Mrs. Reed, I want to start by saying how sorry we all are for your loss, and how much we want to find a resolution here that protects everyone involved, especially you and your daughter." He talked for several minutes in that register before getting to the point. Greg was prepared to offer me an immediate buyout of my full ownership stake in Reed and Walsh Builders. Not the lowball figure I'd expected, but a genuinely substantial sum, nearly double what an independent appraisal might have suggested the company was worth, payable within 30 days, no further obligations, no need for any audit or unpleasantness to proceed. In exchange, Higgins continued, Mr. Walsh would ask that you withdraw the licensing board complaint and any related inquiries on the understanding that the financial irregularities your husband may have flagged were the result of a misunderstanding between business partners that's now best resolved privately, between family, so to speak. I sat very still, the phone warm against my ear, and felt something cold settle into place behind my ribs. Not fear this time, but a kind of clarity I almost didn't recognize in myself. They were offering me money to make my husband's last act of conscience disappear. They were offering to buy my silence about families who'd lost their savings to a man who'd sat at my dinner table. I'll discuss it with my attorney, I said, and hung up before Higgins could say anything else. Tom wasn't surprised when I told him. Classic move, he said. Make the buyout generous enough that walking away looks reasonable, even responsible. Protecting your daughter's future, not chasing a vendetta. They're hoping grief and exhaustion do the rest. I want you to know there's no legal obligation for you to accept any settlement that requires withdrawing a fraud complaint already filed with a state board. That complaint isn't really yours to withdraw at this point anyway. It's the board's matter now. I told Tom to relay formally that I wasn't interested, and I didn't dress it up in any of the soft language Higgins had used. I wanted Greg to understand clearly that this wasn't a negotiation. For nearly 2 weeks after that, things went quiet, unnervingly quiet. No calls from Greg, no visits, no further offers from Higgins. Tom said this likely meant Greg was regrouping, talking to his own lawyers about damage control, perhaps even quietly trying to move or hide assets before the audit could be completed, which Tom was already working with the forensic accountant and increasingly with the FBI contact to prevent. It was during that strange, watchful quiet that I found myself needing people in a way I hadn't fully let myself need them since Daniel died. I'd spent the better part of a year operating in a kind of careful isolation, protecting Mia from the worst of my fear, not wanting to burden Karen more than I already had, keeping even close friends at arm's length because I didn't know how to explain a hidden safe and $6 million without sounding like I'd lost my mind. But grief and fear in isolation, I was learning, calcify into something brittle. I called Lisa Chen, a friend from Mia's school whose own background, it turned out, was in forensic accounting. She'd done corporate audit work for 15 years before going part-time when her kids were small. I'd known her casually for years without ever knowing this about her. When I finally told her, haltingly, sitting in her kitchen with 2 cups of cooling coffee between us, the whole strange story. The note, the weight, the safe, Greg's threats. She didn't flinch the way I'd feared. She leaned forward instead, eyes sharp with focus. "Sarah, I want to look at that ledger," she said, not instead of Tom's accountant, alongside them. 2 sets of eyes catch things 1 set misses, especially with construction billing, which has more places to hide money than almost any other industry I've worked in. Having Lisa in my corner, someone with real expertise who believed me immediately and without reservation, did something for my confidence that I hadn't realized I was missing. So did the evening, a week later, when Karen drove down unannounced with a casserole and a bottle of wine and simply sat with me on the back porch until midnight, not offering advice, just present, the way good sisters are. I also, gently, started talking to Mia. Not about the money, not yet, but about the fact that some difficult things were happening with Daddy's old company, that some people might say unkind things, and that, whatever she heard, her father had been a good and honest man who'd tried, at real cost to himself, to do the right thing. She hugged me hard that night and said, "I know, Mom. I always knew that about him." It was the first time in almost a year that I cried without it feeling entirely like grief. Some of it, for the first time, felt like pride. The invitation arrived by text from Donna Walsh, Greg's wife, 10 days after my conversation with Lisa. A warm, almost cheerful message asking if I'd come to dinner at their house that Friday. Just the two families like old times before things get more complicated. I almost said no immediately, but Tom, when I told him, said something that changed my mind. "Going might actually help us," he said. "If they're trying one more angle before things escalate further, better you hear it directly than secondhand. Just don't agree to anything, don't sign anything, and call me the moment you're home." I went. Mia stayed at Karen's that night. I didn't want her anywhere near whatever this was. The Walsh's house looked exactly as it always had. The same wreath on the door, the same smell of Donna's pot roast drifting from the kitchen, and for the first 10 minutes sitting at their dining table, it was almost possible to pretend none of the last year had happened. Greg asked about Mia's softball season. Donna refilled my wine glass and talked about a kitchen renovation. It was, I realized partway through, a performance, and a skillful one, designed to lull me back into the comfortable 15-year rhythm of friendship before the real conversation began. It began over dessert. Donna set down her fork and reached across the table to take my hand, her eyes wet in a way that looked, in the moment, almost convincing. "Sarah, we love you. We love Mia like she's our own. This whole last year has been so hard for all of us, and I can't stand the thought of this tearing our families apart over something that can still be fixed quietly, between us." Greg picked it up smoothly from there, his tone gentler than it had been on my porch, almost pleading now instead of threatening. "I made mistakes, Sarah. I'm not going to pretend I didn't cut corners I shouldn't have cut. But Daniel knew about more of it than that letter probably told you. We made those calls together in a bad stretch for the business, and I think some part of him felt guilty enough about that to want to come clean in a way that, frankly, put all the blame on me and none on himself. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because I think you deserve the whole truth before you destroy two families over half of it." It was a careful, ugly thing to say, not an outright lie I could immediately disprove, but a seed of doubt planted exactly where it would hurt most, aimed straight at my faith in my husband. I felt my chest tighten, the old grief and the new fear tangling together. For one unsteady moment, I almost wavered. Then Donna squeezed my hand again. "We're not asking you to do anything except slow down. Talk to your lawyer about pausing the complaint, just for a little while. while we sort out a private settlement that's fair to everyone. Fair to you, fair to Mia's future, fair to the employees who'll lose their jobs if this company collapses under an investigation. That's all we're asking. A pause for family. And there it was, the real ask, wrapped in grief talk and old affection. A pause that would, I understood with sudden cold clarity, give Greg exactly the time he needed to move money, alter records, prepare a defense, perhaps even leave the state. I thought of Daniel's letter, the specific, deliberate date he'd chosen, the care he'd taken to protect me from exactly this kind of moment, sitting at a familiar table, surrounded by familiar warmth, being asked to trade truth for comfort. I took my hand back, gently but unmistakably, and folded it in my lap. "I'm not going to ask Tom to pause anything," I said. "And Greg, if you and Daniel made some bad calls together early on, that's between you and whatever the audit finds. But I read his ledger. I read 2 years of him trying to undo what you kept doing. I'm not going to let you rewrite who he was to save yourself." The warmth drained out of the room instantly. Greg's jaw tightened. Donna's eyes, a moment ago so convincingly wet, went hard and flat. "You're going to regret this," Greg said quietly now, all pretense gone. "You have no idea what you're about to do to this town, to those employees, to your daughter's last name." I stood up. I think I should go. Neither of them walked me to the door. I drove home alone in the dark, hands tight on the wheel, replaying every word, and by the time I pulled into my own driveway, the fear had settled into something steadier. Not gone, but contained, like a coal, banked for the night instead of a fire raging out of control. I called Tom from the kitchen, told him everything, and when I finally hung up near midnight, I sat for a long moment in the quiet house and realized that whatever small, frightened part of me had still been hoping this could end gently, with old friends finding their way back to each other, was finally, completely gone. What replaced it wasn't despair, it was resolve, colder and more durable than anything fear could touch. The audit took 6 more weeks to complete, and during that time I learned to live inside a strange, suspended kind of patience. Not the frightened waiting of the year before, but something more deliberate. The patience of a person who finally understands exactly what she's waiting for. Lisa worked alongside Tom's forensic accountant most evenings after her own kids were in bed, the two of them comparing notes over video calls, cross-referencing Daniel's handwritten ledger against 3 years of city permit records, supplier invoices, and bank statements that Tom had subpoenaed through the licensing board's investigative authority. What they found went beyond even what Daniel had documented. Greg had continued diverting funds for nearly 4 months after Daniel's death, apparently believing that with his partner gone and the operating agreement deadline not yet reached, no one was watching closely enough to notice. The state licensing board scheduled a formal hearing for the 2nd week of September, and separately, Tom's FBI contact informed him that the Bureau's white-collar crimes unit had opened its own parallel investigation, given that several of the defrauded clients had used federally backed construction loans, which meant wire fraud, a federal matter, not just a state licensing violation. The hearing itself was held in a plain municipal conference room in downtown Asheville. Nothing like the courtroom dramas I'd half expected, just rows of folding chairs, a panel of 3 board members at a long table, and far more people in attendance than I'd anticipated. 6 of Greg's former clients, families who'd lost tens of thousands of dollars on homes that were never properly finished, sitting in the back rows with the particular stillness of people who'd waited a long time to be heard. Greg arrived with Carl Higgins at his side, dressed in a suit that looked unfamiliar on him, his usual easy confidence visibly strained. He wouldn't meet my eyes as we filed in. Tom presented our case first, methodical, unhurried, walking the board through Daniel's ledger, the falsified permits, the shell supplier registered to Donna Walsh, the timeline of diverted escrow funds stretching back nearly 3 years. Lisa testified for almost 40 minutes, laying out the forensic trail in plain, careful language even a layperson could follow, pointing to specific invoice numbers projected on a screen, specific dates, specific dollar amounts that didn't match any actual work performed. I watched 2 of the board members' faces shift from polite attention to something harder as the picture assembled itself in front of them. Then it was Greg's turn, and this was the moment Tom had warned me would be decisive. Not because Greg could disprove the documents, which were by now essentially airtight, but because of how he chose to respond to them. Higgins tried to frame the diverted funds as internal cost management decisions within the partnership's discretion, a narrative I recognized instantly from Greg's dinner table performance weeks earlier. But when one of the board members asked Greg directly why his wife's company had been paid for foundation work that city permits showed was never inspected or completed, Greg's composure finally cracked. "That arrangement existed before I even knew the full details," he said too quickly, contradicting something Higgins had argued only minutes before. "Daniel set up some of those supplier relationships originally." "Mr. Walsh," the board chair interrupted, not unkindly but firmly, "your own attorney just told us these were cost management decisions within your discretion. Now you're telling us your deceased partner set up the relationships you didn't fully understand. Which is it?" Greg opened his mouth and nothing useful came out. I watched from my seat beside Tom as the careful story he and Donna had built, the one designed for dinner tables and porches and quiet, persuasive phone calls, simply failed to survive contact with a room full of people who only wanted the documented truth. He glanced toward Donna, seated in the front row, and she looked away from him, her face white and tight, perhaps only now fully grasping how much had been hers as well as his. One of the defrauded clients, an older man named Harold Vance, who'd lost nearly $40,000 on a home addition that was never finished, was permitted to speak near the end of the hearing. He didn't raise his voice. He simply described, in plain words, what it had been like to drain his retirement savings for a project that left his house with an unfinished foundation and a hole where a sunroom should have been, while the man across the room who built nothing kept smiling at him in the hardware store parking lot for 2 years afterward. By the time the hearing adjourned, with the board announcing it would issue findings within 30 days and formally referring the matter to the federal investigators already involved, Greg looked nothing like the confident, gentle-voiced man who'd sat across from me on my own porch, threatening to drag my husband's name through the mud. He looked smaller, cornered, genuinely afraid for the first time since this had all begun. I didn't feel triumphant walking out of that conference room. Not exactly. What I felt was steadier than triumph. A quiet, settled certainty that I had done exactly what Daniel had asked of me, exactly what he hadn't been able to finish himself. Tom touched my shoulder in the parking lot and said simply, "He's done, Sarah. You did this." I nodded, but in my mind, it wasn't really me. It was Daniel. 2 years of quiet courage finally finding its way into daylight, with me as the hand that had carried it across the finish line. The licensing board's findings, issued 30 days later, were unsparing. Greg Walsh's contractor's license was revoked permanently, the board's decision citing a sustained pattern of deliberate financial deception causing substantial harm to multiple clients. Language Tom told me was unusually harsh for a typically measured bureaucratic body. Reed and Walsh Builders' business license was suspended pending the federal investigation, and the company, as it had existed for 15 years, effectively ceased operating that same week. The federal case moved faster than Tom had warned me to expect, propelled by the board's findings and by Harold Vance and 2 other defrauded clients agreeing to testify before a grand jury. By November, Greg was indicted on 7 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of bank fraud, tied directly to the falsified invoices and the shell supplier company registered to Donna. Bank records showed she'd actively managed its accounts, transferring diverted funds into an account used to renovate their lake house 2 summers earlier. She was charged as a co-conspirator. I wasn't in the courtroom for the plea hearing. Tom attended on my behalf, since I had no formal standing in the criminal proceedings beyond having been a whistleblower's widow. He called afterward from the courthouse steps. Facing the federal evidence, Greg accepted a plea: 4 years in prison, restitution to all 11 affected families totaling just over $3 million, and a permanent bar from holding a contractor's license or operating a construction business in North Carolina again. Donna pleaded to a lesser conspiracy charge, avoiding prison but accepting probation, a fine and her own restitution tied to the lake house funds. There was no settlement, no quiet resolution over dinner, no version of events where Greg's reputation or freedom survived intact. The company he and Daniel built together was dissolved that summer, its remaining assets liquidated toward the restitution order. The Walshes sold their house, the same house where I'd once been asked to look away, within months, moving to live with Donna's parents 2 states away while Greg served his sentence. Watching this unfold, I felt surprisingly little satisfaction in the cruelty of it, mostly a sense that the scales, badly tilted for 2 years, had finally come level. The 11 defrauded families began receiving restitution that fall, including Harold Vance, who called me personally just to say thank you and to tell me he'd finally hired a contractor to finish the sunroom Greg had left half-built for 2 years. With full ownership of Daniel's half of the dissolved company and Greg's share forfeited as part of the settlement, I found myself in possession of considerably more than the $6 million from the garage safe, though most existed only as legal entitlement to remaining assets still working through final accounting. Tom helped set up a structured plan, a trust for Mia's education, a reserve fund for any clients who came forward later, and the rest invested conservatively, the way Daniel himself would have wanted. I opened the original safe's cash in full and used part of it, as his letter had asked, to personally cover restitution for 2 families whose losses fell outside the federal order. It felt like closing a circle Daniel had started and never finished, like finally saying on his behalf, "I'm sorry, and here is what's owed to you." Mia, 16 by then, sat with me the evening I signed the final paperwork and asked on the drive home whether she thought her dad would be proud. I told her the truth, that I thought he would be, not because of the money or because Greg had lost everything, but because the families who'd been hurt were finally made whole, which was what Daniel had cared about most in his last frightened months. She reached over and took my hand the way she used to as a little girl, and we drove the rest of the way home in a silence that, for the first time in over a year, didn't ache at all. The next 2 years brought a steadiness I hadn't believed I'd feel again. I started a small, honest construction company, Reed Family Builders, hiring Lisa as controller and finally finishing Harold Vance's sunroom exactly as promised, 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Mia graduated high school with an engineering scholarship, telling me my rebuilding was part of why she wanted to build things that don't fall apart. Greg served just under 3 years before release on good behavior, his license permanently revoked. Unable to find work in construction or finance, he ended up at a hardware store 2 counties over. Donna divorced him during his sentence and moved away to live near her parents, her own conviction following her like a shadow no matter how far she went. I felt a grim satisfaction hearing this, but mostly, as time passed, I thought about them less and less. My days filled instead with client meetings, Mia's calls from college, and Sunday dinners at Karen's farmhouse. 2 years after the hearing, standing in my garage, the safe long emptied, now holding paint cans and gardening tools, I thought of Daniel with gratitude, not grief. He'd given me exactly what I needed, not a shortcut through the hardest year of my life, but the tools to walk through it standing upright. Looking back now, I understand that Daniel's last gift wasn't the money in that safe. It was patience and trust and the courage to wait for truth instead of grabbing at comfort. Grief tempts us to rush, to settle, to look away. But some debts can only be paid by standing still long enough to see clearly, then acting without flinching. So I'll ask you what I've asked myself every day since. If you opened a hidden safe and found both a fortune and a betrayal inside it, what would you do? If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And thank you truly for listening.